June 15th, 2024. Hudson Valley, New York State. An abandoned railway tunnel carved through solid rock over a century ago, silent and forgotten since the line closed in 1965. The tunnel was part of what had once been the Hudson Valley Railroad line, a route that connected Manhattan to small towns along the Hudson River. In its heyday, trains ran through this tunnel dozens of times daily, carrying commuters, freight, and the hopes of people traveling between the city and the countryside. But by the mid-1960s, the line had become unprofitable. Roads and highways had replaced railways. The Hudson Valley line shut down, the tracks were eventually removed, and the tunnels were sealed and abandoned. For nearly 60 years, the Merrick Tunnel, as it was known, sat empty. Nature began reclaiming it. Water seeped through cracks in the rock. Vegetation grew at the entrances. The structure, once maintained by railway engineers, deteriorated slowly in the darkness. Local authorities marked it as condemned, dangerous, off-limits. Warning signs were posted. Fences were erected. But as often happens with abandoned places, the warnings only made it more attractive to those seeking adventure. On June 15th, 2024, a team of urban explorers received special permission from the New York State Railway Historical Society to document the Merrick Tunnel before it was permanently sealed as part of a safety initiative. The team, led by Marcus Webb, a structural engineer with expertise in historical railway infrastructure, included photographers, historians, and safety specialists. They had proper equipment, proper permits, and proper respect for the danger they were entering. They entered the tunnel at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The entrance was on the north side of a mountain, a massive stone arch now covered in moss and vines. Inside, the tunnel stretched for 2 miles through solid rock, emerging on the south side of the mountain. Or at least it had once. According to historical records, a section of the tunnel approximately 1 mile in had suffered a partial collapse decades ago. The exact date of the collapse was uncertain in the historical records, listed vaguely as sometime in the early 1960s. Marcus and his team were specifically interested in documenting that collapsed section. They wanted to assess the structural damage, photograph it for historical archives, and help authorities understand what needed to be done to make the tunnel permanently safe before it was sealed forever. They walked carefully through the darkness, their LED headlamps cutting through air that hadn't been disturbed by human presence in decades. The tunnel walls were slick with moisture. Water dripped from the ceiling. The ground was uneven, littered with debris that had accumulated over 60 years. Fallen rocks, pieces of old railway equipment, trash that had blown in from the entrances. At approximately 11:30 a.m., after walking for over an hour, the team reached the collapsed section. It was more extensive than they'd expected. A portion of the tunnel ceiling had given way, filling the passage with tons of rock and earth. The collapse created a massive pile of rubble that blocked the tunnel completely. Any train traveling through when this happened would have had nowhere to go, no way to stop in time. Marcus and his team began documenting the site, taking photographs, making notes about the structural damage. One of the team members, Jennifer Hayes, a photographer specializing in architectural documentation, was positioning her camera to capture the full extent of the collapse when her light caught something that didn't belong. Partially buried in the rubble, about 15 feet into the collapsed section, was what appeared to be a piece of vintage luggage. A leather suitcase, brown, with brass fixtures that had corroded green with age. Next to it, barely visible beneath rocks and earth, was a small leather purse. Jennifer called Marcus over. Together, they carefully approached, moving rocks aside, revealing more, And then they saw it. Human skeletal remains, partially buried in the rubble. The skeleton was mostly complete, though the clothing had deteriorated significantly over the decades, leaving only fragments of fabric and some buttons that suggested mid-20th century women's attire. The bone structure indicated the remains were female. She was positioned as if she'd been walking, perhaps running, when the collapse occurred. One arm was raised, as if trying to shield her head. The other arm extended forward, as if reaching for something or trying to find her way in darkness. The small purse, when carefully examined, contained items that had survived in varying conditions. The leather purse itself, though cracked and brittle, had provided some protection from moisture. Inside was a compact mirror with the glass cracked. Remnants of what might have been a lipstick tube and a small leather wallet. The wallet, opened carefully by forensic technicians back at the lab, contained several items. Most were too deteriorated to be useful, but crucially, an identification card had been partially protected by the wallet's leather folds. Though water-damaged and faded, enough remained legible to make out a name: Madison Clark. The address was partially visible, showing a town in upstate New York. The date was difficult to read, but appeared to be from the 1950s. Marcus immediately contacted authorities. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the tunnel was secured as a scene for investigation. By evening, forensic teams from the New York State Police were carefully excavating the remains. The identification process would take several days. The partial name on the damaged ID card provided a crucial lead. Investigators researched missing persons cases from the era and location indicated on the card. They found a case matching. The profile, Madison Rose Clark, age 23, reported missing in October 1958 after boarding a train that passed through this very tunnel. Historical dental records were requested from the case file. Fortunately, Madison's dentist's records had been archived and were still accessible. Comparison with the skeletal remains provided a definitive match. Additional isotope analysis of the bone tissue was consistent with someone who'd grown up in the northeastern United States in the 1930s and 40s. The identification was confirmed. These were the remains of Madison Rose Clark. Madison Clark had been missing for 66 years. And all that time, she'd been less than 1 mile from where she'd last been seen, buried in a collapsed railway tunnel that no one had thought to thoroughly search. Before we continue with this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on October 12, 1958, involves a young woman traveling home from the city, a journey she'd made dozens of times before. But that night, something went terribly wrong, and Madison Clark never made it home. By the end, you will understand how a railway company's negligence and a desperate decision led to a tragedy that remained hidden for over 6 decades. The questions investigators faced were haunting. How did Madison end up in that tunnel? Why had she left the train? And most troubling of all, had she been alive when the tunnel collapsed, trapped in the darkness, unable to escape? Madison Rose Clark was 23 years old in October 1958, at a point in her life where everything seemed possible. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with blonde hair she wore in the short, curled style popular in the late 50s. Her eyes were blue-gray, her smile was quick and genuine, and she had an energy about her that people found magnetic. She was ambitious, modern for her era, the kind of young woman who wasn't content to stay in a small town and follow the traditional path. She'd been born in July 1935 in the small town of Harrisville, New York, population approximately 2,000, nestled in the Hudson Valley. Her father, Thomas Clark, owned a small dairy farm. Her mother, Dorothy, managed the household and helped with the farm. Madison had one younger sister, Caroline, who was 18 in 1958 and still living at home. Growing up on a farm in rural New York during the Depression and World War II shaped Madison into someone practical and hardworking. She helped with farm chores from a young age, learned to value money and stability, and understood that life required effort and determination. But she also dreamed of something beyond the farm, beyond Harrisville. She loved reading fashion magazines, listening to radio programs about life in New York City, imagining a world larger than the one she'd been born into. Madison was bright. She graduated from Harrisville High School in 1953 at the top of her class. She'd wanted to go to college, to study business or perhaps journalism, but college was expensive and her family couldn't afford it. So she did what many young women of limited means did in the 1950s. She learned to type and take shorthand, skills that could lead to secretarial work in the city. In September 1954, at age 19, Madison took a bold step. She moved to Manhattan. She'd saved money from working at the local general store after high school, enough for a few months' rent in a boarding house for young women in the garment district. She found work as a typist at a small advertising firm, making enough to cover her modest expenses with a little left over to save. Manhattan in the mid-1950s was exciting for a young woman from rural New York. Madison lived in a boarding house with 8 other young women, all working various office jobs, all navigating the city together. She learned to use the subway system, discovered coffee shops and bookstores, went to museums on her lunch breaks. The work was tedious sometimes, long hours of typing correspondence and filing documents, but it was respectable work, and it paid. By 1958, Madison had been promoted twice. She was now a secretary to one of the account executives at the firm, making a decent salary, able to afford a small studio apartment in a better neighborhood. She'd made friends, gone on dates with various young men, though nothing serious had developed, and generally built a life for herself. She was proud of what she'd accomplished, proud of her independence. But Madison remained close to her family. Every other weekend, sometimes every weekend when she could afford the train fare, she'd take the Hudson Valley line from Grand Central Terminal to Harrisville. The trip took about 2.5 hours, with the train making stops at various small towns along the Hudson River before reaching Harrisville. Madison would board the 6 p.m. train on Sunday evening after spending the weekend at home, arriving back in Manhattan by 8:30 p.m., giving her time to prepare for work on Monday morning. Her parents looked forward to these visits. Her father, now in his early 60s and slowing down, appreciated Madison's help around the farm. Her mother loved having her daughter home, cooking her favorite meals, catching up on her life in the city. Her sister, Caroline, idolized Madison, saw her as proof that life beyond Harrisville was possible. Madison's visits followed a routine. She'd arrive in Harrisville on Friday evening, taking the late train that arrived around 9 p.m. Her father would pick her up at the small station in his truck. Saturday and Sunday, she'd help around the farm, spend time with family, attend church on Sunday morning, visit with old friends who still lived in town. Sunday evening, her father would drive her back to the station for the 6 p.m. train to Manhattan. The weekend of October 10th through 12th, 1958, seemed unremarkable. Madison arrived in Harrisville on Friday evening as usual. The weather was cool but pleasant, autumn colors brilliant in the Hudson Valley. She helped her mother with canning vegetables from the garden. She helped her father repair a fence. She had Sunday dinner with the family, her mother's pot roast and apple pie. She talked about work, about her apartment, about a new restaurant she'd tried in Manhattan. At 5:45 p.m. on Sunday, October 12th, Thomas Clark drove Madison to the Harrisville train station. He helped her with her suitcase, a small brown leather case she'd bought when she first moved to the city. Madison wore a blue dress with a matching jacket, practical traveling clothes. She carried her purse, a small leather bag with her wallet, compact, lipstick, and keys. The Harrisville station was tiny, just a small platform with a covered waiting area and a ticket window that was only staffed when trains were scheduled. Madison had purchased a return ticket on Friday when she'd arrived, so she just walked onto the platform to wait. The 6 p.m. train, which originated further upstate and traveled south to Manhattan, was scheduled to arrive at 6:05 p.m., stopping for 2 minutes before continuing its journey. Thomas Clark waited with his daughter. Several other people were on the platform. Mrs. Helen Morrison, an elderly woman, who'd been visiting family and was returning to her apartment in Yonkers. Robert Sullivan, a businessman who traveled frequently between upstate offices and Manhattan, and 2 teenage boys, James and Michael Porter, heading to the city for a school trip. All of them would later be interviewed by investigators. The train arrived at 6:07 p.m., 2 minutes late. Madison kissed her father's cheek, told him she'd call when she got home, and boarded the train. Thomas watched through the window as she found a seat in the second passenger car, placed her suitcase in the overhead rack, and sat down. She waved to him through the window. He waved back. The train's whistle blew, and at 6:09 p.m., the train pulled away from the Harrisville station, heading south toward Manhattan. That was the last time anyone who knew Madison saw her alive. Somewhere in the next hour and 20 minutes, during the journey from Harrisville to Manhattan, Madison Clark disappeared. Not from the station, not from the city, from a moving train, traveling through the darkness of the Hudson Valley and into a mystery that would remain unsolved for 66 years. The Hudson Valley Line train that left Harrisville at 6:09 p.m. on October 12, 1958, was scheduled to make 5 more stops before reaching Grand Central Terminal in Manhattan. The route went Harrisville, Millbrook, 6:25 p.m., Beacon, 6:40 p.m., Cold Spring, 6:55 p.m., Peekskill, 7:10 p.m., Yonkers, 7:40 p.m., and finally Manhattan at 8:30 p.m. The conductor on duty that evening was William Hayes, a 48-year-old man who'd worked for the Hudson Valley Railroad for 23 years. He knew the route intimately, had punched thousands of tickets on this line. His job was straightforward: collect and punch tickets, ensure passenger safety, coordinate with the engineer regarding stops, help passengers with luggage when needed. Hayes would later tell investigators that he'd collected Madison Clark's ticket shortly after the Harrisville departure, somewhere between Harrisville and Millbrook. He remembered her specifically because she was a regular passenger, traveling this route almost every weekend. He'd exchanged pleasantries with her, she'd smiled and thanked him, and he'd moved on to collect other tickets. Nothing seemed unusual. Madison appeared normal, calm, just another young woman returning to the city after a weekend home. At 6:25 p.m., the train stopped in Millbrook. 3 passengers got off, 2 got on. Hayes checked to ensure everyone was properly boarded before signaling the engineer to continue. The train departed Millbrook at 6:27 p.m. At 6:40 p.m., the train stopped in Beacon. Several passengers disembarked, a few boarded. Again, routine. The train departed Beacon at 6:43 p.m. Here's where the timeline becomes crucial. Between Beacon and Cold Spring, the train passed through the Merrick Tunnel. The tunnel was approximately 2 miles long, carved through a mountain. Trains entered from the north side and emerged on the south side. The journey through the tunnel normally took approximately 7 to 8 minutes at the train's average speed. However, on this particular evening, the journey through the tunnel would take longer than usual. The train entered the Merrick Tunnel at approximately 6:47 p.m. Under normal circumstances, it would have emerged at approximately 6:54 p.m. But circumstances that evening were far from normal. At 7:02 p.m., approximately 4 minutes later than scheduled, the train arrived at the Cold Spring Station. This is when things began to unravel. Mrs. Helen Morrison, the elderly woman who'd boarded at Harrisville and was traveling to Yonkers, approached Conductor Hayes. She was concerned. She'd been sitting across the aisle from a young blonde woman who'd been in her seat until the tunnel. But when the Eternity train emerged from the tunnel and Mrs. Morrison looked over, the seat was empty. The woman's suitcase was still in the overhead rack, but the woman herself was gone. Hayes initially wasn't concerned. Passengers moved around on trains. Perhaps the young woman had gone to the restroom or moved to another car to sit with someone she knew. He told Mrs. Morrison he'd look into it and continued with his duties, helping passengers disembark and board at Cold Spring. But as the train departed, Cold Spring at 7:04 p.m., approximately 7 minutes behind schedule, Hayes decided to walk through the cars and check on the missing passenger. He found Madison's seat in the second car. Her suitcase was still overhead, undisturbed. Her seat was empty. He checked the restroom in that car. Empty. He walked through the entire train, all 4 passenger cars, checking every seat, every restroom. Madison Clark was not on the train. Hayes was now seriously concerned. Passengers don't simply vanish from moving trains. He questioned other passengers. Had anyone seen the young blonde woman leave her seat? Several passengers remembered seeing her sitting alone, reading a magazine. No one had seen her get up or move. No one had noticed when she'd disappeared. The businessman, Robert Sullivan, told Hayes something significant. Sullivan had been sitting 2 rows behind Madison. He dozed off after the train left Harrisville, woken up when the train entered the Merrick Tunnel because the sudden darkness and change in sound always woke him. He'd noticed Madison was still in her seat when they entered the tunnel. He'd dozed off again in the darkness. When he woke as the train emerged from the tunnel into daylight, he'd glanced forward and noticed her seat was empty. He'd assumed she'd gone to the restroom. This narrowed the timeline. Madison had been in her seat when the train entered the Merrick Tunnel at approximately 6:47 p.m. She was gone when the train emerged at approximately 6:54 p.m. She'd disappeared sometime during those 7 minutes in the darkness. At 7:17 p.m., when the train reached Peekskill, Conductor Hayes reported the missing passenger to the station master. The station master immediately contacted railway officials and local police. By 7:47 p.m., when the train reached Yonkers, railway officials were trying to decide what to do. By 8:37 p.m., when the train finally arrived at Grand Central Terminal, in Manhattan running 7 minutes late, a full investigation had been launched. Railway officials initially thought Madison might have somehow fallen from the train. Train doors in 1958 didn't have the safety locks that modern trains have. It was theoretically possible for a passenger to open a door and fall out, though this would be unusual and would likely have been noticed by other passengers. At 9 p.m. that evening, Thomas Clark received a phone call at his Harrisville farm. It was from railway officials. His daughter Madison had boarded the train in Harrisville, but had not been accounted for when the train reached Manhattan. Did Mr. Clark know if Madison had planned to get off at an intermediate stop? Had she mentioned meeting anyone? Was there any reason she might have left the train early? Thomas Clark was bewildered and terrified. No, Madison hadn't planned to get off anywhere except Manhattan. She wouldn't have changed her plans without telling him. She had work the next morning. Her apartment was in Manhattan. There was no reason for her to get off the train early. By midnight on October 12th, a search operation was beginning. Railway officials sent maintenance crews to walk the tracks between Harrisville and Manhattan, looking for any sign of Madison, any indication that she might have fallen from the train. They found nothing. The investigation into Madison Clark's disappearance quickly became one of the most puzzling missing persons cases in New York State history. The New York State Police took over the investigation, working with railway officials, the FBI, and local law enforcement agencies. Every passenger who'd been on the train that evening was interviewed. The most detailed interviews were with those who'd been in Madison's car: Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Sullivan, the Porter brothers, and approximately 20 other passengers. Everyone told the same story. Madison had been in her seat. Then she wasn't. No one had seen her get up. No one had seen her leave the car. She'd simply vanished. Investigators examined every possibility. Could Madison have gotten off at one of the earlier stops without anyone noticing? They checked with station masters at Millbrook and Beacon. No one had seen a young woman matching Madison's description exit the train. Her ticket hadn't been collected by anyone other than Conductor Hayes after leaving Harrisville. Could she have hidden on the train and gotten off in Manhattan without being noticed? Investigators searched Grand Central Terminal, questioned workers there, checked security logs. No evidence of Madison arriving in Manhattan. Could she have fallen from the train? Crews walked every mile of track between Harrisville and Manhattan multiple times. They searched both sides of the tracks, looked in drainage ditches, checked areas where a body might have rolled. They found nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no sign of Madison. The Merrick Tunnel became a focus of investigation because that's where Madison had last been confirmed present. On October 15th, 3 days after Madison's disappearance, railway officials sent a team to inspect the tunnel. They walked through it with flashlights, examining the tracks, the walls, looking for any evidence that Madison might have left the train while it was in the tunnel. But why would she do that? Getting off a train in a pitch-black tunnel would be suicidal. She'd be in complete darkness, with no light source, with trains potentially coming from either direction at any time. It made no sense. The inspection team found nothing unusual in the tunnel. They noted that a section approximately 1 mile in showed some structural concerns, minor cracks in the ceiling and walls, but nothing immediately dangerous. They recommended monitoring but didn't consider it a serious issue. What the inspection team didn't do was thoroughly examine that structurally compromised section. They didn't climb into the cracks or investigate the ceiling closely. They were looking for evidence on the tracks, not in the tunnel structure itself. This oversight would prove significant. Investigators looked into Madison's personal life, searching for any reason she might have voluntarily disappeared. They interviewed her employers, her friends, her landlord. Everyone described Madison as reliable, responsible, happy with her life. She had no financial problems, no romantic troubles, no reason to vanish. They investigated the possibility of foul play. Had someone on the train abducted Madison? But how? Where would they have taken her? Other passengers would have noticed a struggle. And Madison's suitcase was still on the train, untouched. If someone had abducted her, why leave her luggage? The FBI became involved because of the possibility that Madison had been transported across state lines if she'd been kidnapped. They investigated organized crime connections, wondering if Madison had been targeted, for any reason. They found nothing. By December 1958, 2 months after Madison's disappearance, the investigation had reached a dead end. Every lead had been followed. Every theory had been investigated. Madison Clark had simply vanished from a moving train, and no one could explain how or why. The Hudson Valley Railroad, concerned about the negative publicity and the mystery hanging over their line, offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to finding Madison. No one came forward with useful information. In March 1959, 6 months after her disappearance, Madison Clark was declared legally dead by her family's request. This was unusual so soon after a disappearance, but the circumstances were so strange, and the likelihood of her being alive so small, that the court granted the request. Madison's parents held a memorial service at their church in Harrisville. Her sister Caroline spoke about the sister she'd lost, the dreams Madison had pursued, the mystery that haunted their family. Thomas Clark never fully recovered from losing his daughter. He died of a heart attack in 1963, at age 66, having spent his final years wondering what had happened to Madison. Dorothy Clark lived until 1974, always maintaining that someday the truth would emerge. Caroline, Madison's sister, eventually moved away from Harrisville, married, had children, but never forgot her missing sister. The case remained officially open but unsolved. Over the decades, various theories persisted. Some people thought Madison had been murdered by someone on the train, and her body hidden so well it had never been found. Others thought she'd voluntarily disappeared, though this seemed unlikely given her close family ties and her suitcase being left behind. A few people thought something paranormal had occurred, though investigators didn't take such theories seriously. The Hudson Valley Railroad line continued operating until 1965, when it was closed due to declining ridership and unprofitability. The tracks were eventually removed. The stations were torn down or repurposed. The tunnels, including the Merrick Tunnel, were sealed and abandoned. In 1966, 1 year after the line closed, there was a minor news story about the discovery of an old collapse in the Merrick Tunnel. Maintenance workers doing a final safety inspection of abandoned infrastructure for permanent sealing found that a section of the tunnel ceiling had collapsed at some point in the past, blocking the passage. The article noted that this was fortunate to discover now during inspection, as it had apparently existed undetected for years. The workers estimated, based on the condition of the rubble, that the collapse had likely occurred sometime in the late 1950s or early 1960s, possibly around the time the line was still operational but before the regular inspections had documented it. The article didn't mention Madison Clark. Why would it? Her disappearance had been 8 years earlier. The connection wasn't made. And because the tunnel was now permanently abandoned and sealed, no one investigated the collapse closely. It was just another piece of forgotten infrastructure decaying in the darkness. And for 58 more years, from 1966 until 2024, that's where Madison Clark remained. In the collapsed section of the I-tide Merrick Tunnel, buried under tons of rock and earth, her story untold, her fate unknown. The 66 years between Madison Clark's disappearance in 1958 and the discovery of her remains in 2024 saw the world transform beyond recognition. Television replaced radio. Interstate highways replaced railways. Computers, the internet, smartphones, all technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to Madison became everyday reality. But in Harrisville, New York, some things remained constant. The town stayed small, people still farmed, and people still remembered, occasionally, the story of Madison Clark, the local girl who'd disappeared from a train in the 50s. Over decades, the story became local legend, told to newcomers as an example of the area's history, its mysteries. Caroline Clark, Madison's younger sister, lived until 2008, dying at age 68. She'd married, had 3 children, worked as a teacher in a neighboring town. She'd kept Madison's memory alive within the family, told her children and grandchildren about the aunt they'd never met, the mystery that had never been solved. When Caroline died, her oldest daughter, Rebecca Martin, inherited a box of Madison's belongings that Caroline had kept all those years: photographs, letters, Madison's high school yearbook, a scarf Madison had left at the farm on her last visit. Rebecca, who'd grown up hearing stories about her Aunt Madison, became interested in cold cases and unsolved mysteries. She'd occasionally search online for information about Madison's disappearance, hoping that somehow, with modern technology, someone might have solved it. But she found nothing new, just the same basic facts repeated in various online databases of unsolved disappearances. Madison Clark, age 23, disappeared from a train in 1958, never found. The Merrick Tunnel, where Madison had actually been all along, was forgotten by most people. It wasn't accessible to the public. Both entrances had been sealed with concrete barriers in the 1970s after several teenagers had gotten into the tunnel and nearly been hurt by falling rocks. The tunnel simply existed, decaying slowly, noted on old maps, but invisible to modern residents who had no reason to think about abandoned railway infrastructure. But urban exploration, the hobby of investigating abandoned buildings and structures, grew popular in the 2000s. Online, communities shared information about forgotten places, about how to access them safely, or sometimes unsafely. The abandoned railway tunnels of the Hudson Valley became known in these communities as interesting sites worth documenting. However, the Merrick Tunnel's reputation as particularly dangerous kept most explorers away. Online posts warned that it was structurally unsound, that there had been collapses, that entering it was genuinely life-threatening. For most of the 2000s and 2010s, the tunnel remained sealed and unvisited. In 2020, the New York State Railway Historical Society began a project to document abandoned railway infrastructure before it was lost forever. They secured funding from historical preservation grants and began systematically cataloging old stations, bridge ruins, and tunnel systems. The Merrick Tunnel was on their list, but its dangerous reputation meant it would require special permissions, professional structural engineers, proper safety equipment. The project was delayed by COVID-19, then by funding issues, but by 2023, planning was underway. Marcus Webb, a structural engineer specializing in historical infrastructure, was hired to lead the documentation team. Marcus had a particular interest in railway tunnels, having written his master's thesis on 19th-century tunnel construction techniques. The Merrick Tunnel fascinated him because it had been built in the 1880s, using techniques that were advanced for the era but primitive by modern standards. Securing permission to enter the tunnel took months. The land where the tunnel entrances were located was owned by the state. Environmental assessments had to be conducted. Insurance had to be arranged. Safety protocols had to be established. But by June 2024, all permissions were in place. Marcus assembled his team carefully. Besides himself, he included Jennifer Hayes, an architectural photographer who specialized in documenting historical structures, Dr. Robert Chen, a historian focusing on railway history, and 2 safety specialists trained in confined space rescue. They had modern LED lighting, breathing equipment in case air quality was poor, communication equipment, and, most importantly, structural monitoring equipment that could detect shifts in the rock that might indicate imminent collapse. On June 15th, 2024, the team arrived at the north entrance of the Merrick Tunnel. Marcus had studied every available historical document about the tunnel. He knew about the partial collapse that had been reported in 1966. His plan was to proceed slowly through the tunnel, documenting everything until they reached the collapsed section. Then they'd assess whether it was safe to examine the collapse closely or if they'd need to document it remotely. The walk through the Merrick Tunnel was eerie and fascinating. Marcus and his team moved slowly, their lights cutting through darkness that had been undisturbed for decades. The tunnel was approximately 12 feet wide and 14 feet high, carved through solid rock. The original railway tracks had been removed when the line closed, but the wooden ties remained, rotting into the tunnel floor. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, having seeped through cracks in the rock over decades. The walls showed evidence of deterioration, with sections where the rock face had crumbled away. But the overall structure seemed stable, at least in the first mile. They reached the collapsed section at 11:30 a.m. It was more extensive than historical records had suggested. A portion of the tunnel ceiling, approximately 30 feet in length, had given way completely. Tons of rock and earth had fallen, creating a pile of rubble that reached almost to the ceiling, completely blocking passage through the tunnel. Marcus's structural monitoring equipment showed that the collapse was old and stable, not actively shifting. This was good news. It meant they could approach and document it without immediate danger of further collapse. The team began taking photographs and making notes about the extent of the damage. Jennifer Hayes was setting up her camera equipment to capture the full scale of the collapse when she saw something that made her stop. In the rubble, partially buried, she could see what looked like man-made objects. She called Marcus over. They approached carefully, removing small rocks and earth. The first object Jennifer had spotted was a leather suitcase, severely deteriorated but still recognizable by its shape and brass fixtures, which had corroded heavily with age. The suitcase's contents, when later examined, had mostly disintegrated. Fabrics had rotted, toiletries had corroded or evaporated. What remained were mostly metal items, zipper pulls, the frame of the suitcase, buckles from clothing. These items, along with the style of the suitcase itself, helped date the remains to the mid-20th century. Next to the suitcase was a smaller leather purse, also deteriorated but more intact due to its smaller size and protective leather construction. And then they found the remains. A human skeleton, partially buried in the rubble pile, positioned in a way that suggested the person had been moving, perhaps trying to navigate through or around the collapsed rock. The skeleton was mostly complete. Clothing had almost entirely disintegrated, leaving only fragments and fasteners. Analysis of these fragments suggested mid-20th century women's clothing. Buttons, a deteriorated zipper, remnants of what might have been a dress or skirt. Marcus immediately called the authorities. The tunnel was declared a crime scene, though everyone suspected this was not a crime, but a tragedy, an accident that had somehow gone undiscovered for decades. Over the next 3 days, a forensic team carefully excavated the remains from the rubble. The work was delicate and dangerous, as disturbing the rubble risked further collapse. But the team succeeded in recovering Madison's skeletal remains, her suitcase, her purse, and various personal items that had been with her. The purse, when opened, contained remarkably few intact items after 6 decades. A compact mirror, its glass long shattered. The corroded remains of what might have been a lipstick tube. And a small wallet. Inside the wallet, forensic technicians found what would become the crucial piece of evidence, a partially legible identification card. Water damage and time had taken their toll, but enough text remained visible to read a name and partial address. This discovery would lead investigators to connect these remains to a 66-year-old missing persons case. The forensic team researched the name and immediately found the missing persons case from 1958. Dental records were obtained from the historical case file and compared to the skeletal remains. The ID match was definitive. These were Madison Clark's remains. But how had she ended up in the tunnel? That was the question forensic investigators needed to answer with the limited evidence available. They carefully examined everything that had been recovered. The suitcase, though deteriorated, contained metal components and fasteners that confirmed it was from the mid-20th century and consistent with women's travel luggage of that era. The purse and its partially legible contents established a probable identity. The skeletal remains themselves told part of the story. The forensic examination of the skeletal remains showed no signs of trauma that would indicate foul play before the collapse. No broken bones suggesting she'd been struck or pushed from the train. No signs of ligature marks or defensive wounds. The only injuries detected were fractures and trauma patterns consistent with being struck by falling rocks during the tunnel collapse. This ruled out murder, but couldn't definitively explain how Madison ended up in the tunnel in the first place. Railway historians were consulted. They examined historical records from the Hudson Valley Railroad for October 1958. And there, buried in maintenance logs that had been archived and largely forgotten, they found something significant. On October 12, 1958, the same day Madison disappeared, there had been an incident with the 6 p.m. train from upstate to Manhattan. The train had experienced an emergency stop inside the Merrick Tunnel. The engineer's log noted, "Emergency brake applied at 6:49 p.m. due to unusual sound and vibration in tunnel. Stopped train. Proceeded cautiously. Cleared tunnel at 6:58 p.m." The incident had been reported, but not investigated thoroughly because the train had proceeded safely and arrived in Manhattan only slightly behind schedule. Additional maintenance records from the following days showed that railway engineers had inspected the Merrick Tunnel on October 14th and found evidence of a partial ceiling collapse in the section approximately 1 mile in. The engineer's report noted, "Recent rockfall estimated to have occurred in past 48 hours. Section unstable. Recommend reduced speeds through tunnel and further monitoring." But there was no mention in these reports of checking for people who might have been in the tunnel when the collapse occurred. Why would there be? It was a railway tunnel, not a public space. No one had any reason to be in there except train passengers, and all the train's passengers had been accounted for. Or so it had seemed. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together into a theory, though investigators emphasized that after 66 years, absolute certainty was impossible. What they had was skeletal remains in a collapsed tunnel section, railway records showing an emergency stop in that tunnel on the night of Madison's disappearance, the position of the body, suggesting she'd been alive and moving when the final collapse occurred, and the absence of evidence suggesting foul play. From these pieces, they constructed the most logical explanation, knowing that the exact sequence of events would remain speculation. The truth about what happened to Madison Clark on October 12, 1958, can never be known with absolute certainty. After 66 years, forensic evidence can only tell part of the story. What follows is the most likely reconstruction based on a combination of forensic analysis, historical railway records, and the circumstances of the discovery. Investigators emphasize that while the general sequence of events is supported by evidence, many specific details remain speculation. What investigators know for certain: Madison Clark boarded a train in Harrisville at 6:09 p.m. on October 12, 1958. The train passed through the Merrick Tunnel between approximately 6:47 p.m. and 6:58 p.m. Madison was on the train when it entered the tunnel, but was not on the train when it emerged. Madison's remains were found in the collapsed section of that tunnel, approximately 1 mile from the north entrance. Her skeletal remains showed injuries consistent with being struck by falling rocks. The position of her body suggested she'd been alive and moving when the final collapse occurred. From these facts, investigators constructed the following theory. The train Madison was on entered the Merrick Tunnel at approximately 6:47 p.m. The tunnel was completely dark, as was normal. At approximately 6:49 p.m., while the train was about 1 mile into the 2-mile tunnel, the engineer noticed something wrong. Unusual sounds and vibrations. He applied the emergency brake, bringing the train to a stop inside the tunnel. What the engineer had felt was the beginning of the tunnel collapse. The section of ceiling that had shown minor structural concerns was failing. Rock and earth were beginning to fall. The collapse was progressive, not instantaneous. It likely started with smaller rocks falling, creating the sound and vibration the engineer detected. When the train stopped, there would have been confusion among passengers in the complete darkness. The emergency brake would have caused a sudden jolt. People would have been alarmed, wondering what was happening. Conductor Hayes would have been trying to calm passengers, trying to get information from the engineer about what caused the stop. Madison Clark, sitting in her seat in the second passenger car, would have heard and felt something terrifying. Rocks falling and hitting the train car. Evidence suggests the initial collapse was occurring near where her car was positioned. In the darkness, with the sound of rock falling all around, investigators believe Madison panicked. The theory is that she made a decision that sealed her fate. She opened the car door and stepped out into the tunnel. Why would she do something so dangerous? Investigators can only speculate. Fear, most likely. In her terrified state, she may have thought being on the train was more dangerous than getting off it. She perhaps thought the tunnel was collapsing and the train would be buried. She thought she could escape by leaving the train. Once out of the train car, Madison would have found herself in complete darkness on a railway tunnel floor, with rocks continuing to fall around her. She couldn't see anything. She didn't have a flashlight. Why would she? She'd been traveling on a train, not exploring a tunnel. She would have been disoriented, terrified, with no idea which direction was safe. The train, meanwhile, had been stopped for less than 2 minutes. The engineer, assessing the situation, decided the safest course was to proceed slowly through the tunnel rather than attempt to back up in the darkness with falling debris. At approximately 6:51 p.m., the train began moving forward. Again, traveling slowly. Did Madison realize the train was leaving? Did she try to get back on? Investigators can only speculate. The evidence suggests she was near the point of collapse, probably had moved away from where the train had stopped, was lost in the darkness when the train proceeded. Whether she heard the train leaving or was too disoriented to understand what was happening will never be known. The train cleared the tunnel at 6:58 p.m. Conductor Hayes, checking the cars, after they emerged, discovered Madison was missing. But he had no idea she'd gotten off the train in the tunnel. He thought she'd disappeared somehow during the journey, perhaps at one of the previous stops. The investigation that followed focused on whether she'd fallen from the train or gotten off at a station, not on whether she'd deliberately left the train in the tunnel. This was understandable. No one could have imagined a passenger would exit a train in a pitch-black tunnel. Meanwhile, Madison was trapped in the darkness of the Merrick Tunnel. Investigators believe she would have heard the train leaving, the sound fading away, leaving her in silence and complete darkness. She likely tried to walk toward one of the exits, But which direction? In complete darkness, disoriented and panicked, she might have walked the wrong way, or simply been unable to navigate the distance. The forensic evidence suggests Madison survived the initial collapse, but was in the tunnel when a major collapse occurred, likely within hours of the initial incident. The position of her remains, partially buried in rubble with one arm raised as if to shield her head, indicated she'd been alive and moving when tons of rock fell. Whether the collapse happened minutes after the train left or hours later is impossible to determine. What's certain is that Madison Clark died in that tunnel from blunt force trauma caused by falling rocks and subsequent burial under debris. Her death was officially listed as accidental by the medical examiner. The cause of death was clear from the skeletal evidence. The circumstances leading to her being in the tunnel at all remained a theory, albeit one supported by the available evidence and historical records. The railway company, based on available historical records, appeared to bear some responsibility. Maintenance reports from months before October 1958 showed that structural concerns in the Merrick Tunnel had been noted by engineers. Recommendations for repairs had been made, but apparently not prioritized. When the collapse occurred, the company investigated the damage to their tunnel, but the investigation focused on infrastructure, not on whether anyone might have been harmed. The fact that the missing passenger investigation was happening simultaneously with the tunnel collapse investigation, but the two were never connected, represented a failure of communication and procedure. However, the Hudson Valley Railroad no longer existed, having been dissolved decades ago. After 66 years, establishing definitive responsibility or liability was impossible. There was no one left to hold accountable, no company to sue, no justice to be found, except the truth itself, incomplete as it was. The news of Madison Clark's discovery spread quickly in June 2024. It was a national story. The missing woman found after 66 years. Rebecca Martin, Madison's niece and Caroline's daughter, was contacted by investigators. She'd never met Madison. Her aunt had disappeared 13 years before Rebecca was born, but she'd grown up with Madison's story. "My mother, Caroline, never stopped hoping we'd find out what happened," Rebecca told reporters. "She died in 2008, not knowing. I was 37 when she passed. When investigators called in 2024 to tell me they'd found Madison, I cried. After 66 years, our family finally knows. It doesn't bring Madison back, but it gives us answers. It lets us finally lay her to rest properly." Madison Rose Clark was buried on July 20th, 2024, in a cemetery in Harrisville, New York, next to her parents, who'd been buried decades earlier. Over 200 people attended the funeral, mostly people who'd never met Madison, but who'd been touched by her story. Rebecca spoke about the aunt she'd never known, about dreams cut short, about a life that should have been long and full but was ended at age 23 in the darkness of a collapsing tunnel. The Merrick Tunnel was permanently sealed in August 2024. Before sealing it, workers placed a memorial plaque near the collapsed section, reading, "In memory of Madison Rose Clark, 1935 to 1958, whose life ended here in tragedy. May she rest in peace." The investigation raised questions about how many other unsolved disappearances might have simple, tragic explanations that were never discovered because the right connections weren't made. How many missing persons cases involve people who died in accidents, in places no one thought to look, with causes no one considered? So what really happened to Madison Clark? We know some facts with certainty. She boarded a train in October 1958. The train stopped unexpectedly in a tunnel during a structural collapse. Madison was not on the train when it emerged from the tunnel. Her remains were found 66 years later in that same tunnel, positioned in a way that suggested she'd been trying to navigate through collapsed rubble when more rocks fell. The rest, why she left the train, whether she panicked or made a calculated decision, how long she survived in the darkness, what her final moments were like, these are educated guesses based on circumstances and human psychology. The complete truth died with Madison in that tunnel. It wasn't murder. It wasn't mystery in the traditional sense. It was a tragic accident, compounded by a railway company's apparent negligence, by the chaos of an emergency situation, and by the simple fact that no one thought to connect a missing passenger on a train with a collapsing tunnel until 66 years had passed, and new technology allowed explorers to finally see what had been hidden in the darkness. Madison Clark was 23 years old when she died. She'd built a life for herself in Manhattan, achieved independence, made her family proud. She'd been hours away from home, from her apartment, from her job, from a life that stretched ahead with possibility. And then she was gone, vanished in a moment of panic and bad luck, lost in the darkness for decades. The story of Madison Clark reminds us that sometimes mysteries have mundane explanations, that tragedy can strike without warning or reason, that the missing are sometimes closer than we imagine, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be found. That technology and persistence can answer questions that seemed unanswerable, and that closure, even after 66 years, still matters to those left behind.